He took credit for her work before she rose to become Chief Justice. For 12 days, Joy Bennett walked past the same envelope every morning without opening it. She moved it from the kitchen table when she needed space for her coffee. She set her reading glasses on top of it at night. Once, she even picked it up, turned it over in her hands, and then quietly placed it back exactly where she'd found it. Anyone watching from the outside might have thought it was just another piece of mail. But some letters carry the weight of entire lifetimes. Just after sunrise on the 12th day, her phone rang. "Judge Bennett, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Frederick Hayes passed away early this morning." Joy didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared at the familiar handwriting on the envelope. The same handwriting that had once filled birthday cards, scribbled notes on legal pads, and labeled sketches of a lakeside house they had promised to grow old in together. Outside her apartment window, Chicago was beginning another ordinary day. Commuters hurried down the sidewalks. Car horns echoed in the distance. In less than 3 weeks, Joy would stand before the entire state and take the oath as Chief Justice. But none of that mattered in that moment, because sitting on her kitchen table was a question she had spent 25 years trying not to ask herself. What could a man spend an entire lifetime hiding from the person he once loved most? Slowly, Joy reached for the envelope. She had no idea that opening it would force her to revisit a betrayal that had quietly shaped every year of her life. Welcome to Daily Comfort Stories, my wonderful family. I'm truly grateful to have you here. If you're new, comment your time and where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe as we continue sharing meaningful stories together. The first thing Joy Bennett noticed when the train pulled into downtown Chicago wasn't the skyline. It was how quickly everyone seemed to move. People hurried across the platform with coffee cups in one hand and briefcases in the other, weaving around one another as if they had rehearsed the choreography their entire lives. Joy stood still for a moment, one suitcase at her feet and another hanging awkwardly from her shoulder, trying to convince herself that she belonged among them. She was 23 years old, carrying a law degree paid for by scholarships, summer jobs, and years of sacrifice that belonged as much to her parents as they did to her. Before leaving home that morning, her mother had hugged her in the kitchen and adjusted the collar of her jacket for the 3rd time. "Don't let anybody make you feel smaller than you are," Evelyn Bennett had said. Her father, Nathaniel, had smiled from the doorway, already dressed in his city bus uniform. "And don't forget where you came from." Joy promised she wouldn't, but secretly she worried about something else entirely. She worried that one mistake, one bad argument, one embarrassing failure, one moment of hesitation, would expose her as someone who had somehow slipped into rooms she wasn't meant to enter. That fear had followed her since childhood on Chicago's South Side. Growing up, Joy had been the child everyone trusted to settle disagreements. Neighbors called her over when younger kids argued over basketball games. Teachers asked her to mentor struggling students. Even at family gatherings, her cousins would pull her aside to ask for advice. She listened carefully. She thought before she spoke. People mistook her calmness for confidence. What they didn't see were the nights she lay awake replaying conversations in her head, wondering whether she had said the wrong thing or disappointed someone without realizing it. Nathaniel Bennett used to find her sitting at the kitchen table long after midnight, surrounded by textbooks. "You know," he'd say, pouring himself a glass of water, "you're allowed to rest sometimes." Joy would smile without looking up. "I'll rest when I'm finished." He always gave the same answer. "Baby, people spend their whole lives chasing finished." But Joy never quite believed him. Across the city, Frederick Hayes grew up in a world that looked nothing like hers. Lake Forest was a place of quiet streets, expensive homes, and neighbors who measured success in promotions, country club memberships, and the universities printed on bumper stickers. At dinner, Frederick's father, Charles Hayes, treated achievement like a moral obligation. "Second place means someone worked harder than you did," he would say, folding his newspaper. "Remember that." Frederick's mother, Margaret Hayes, had once dreamed of becoming a lawyer herself before giving up her career to raise a family. Sometimes, Frederick caught her staring at old law books in the study, but she rarely spoke about the life she had left behind. Frederick learned early that praise in his house came with conditions. Good grades earned approval. Winning earned affection. Anything less earned silence. By the time he graduated law school, people described him as charismatic and confident. He could walk into a room full of strangers and have them laughing within minutes. What nobody understood, not even Frederick himself, was how terrified he was of becoming ordinary. Failure didn't scare him nearly as much as irrelevance. On a grey Monday morning in September, both Joy Bennett and Frederick Hayes walked through the revolving doors of Whitmore and Aldridge, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms. Joy arrived 10 minutes early, clutching a notebook against her chest. Frederick arrived with an easy smile and a joke for the receptionist. Neither of them noticed the other. Neither of them could have imagined that the person stepping into that building at the exact same moment would someday become both the love of their life and the source of their deepest regret. By the end of their first month at Whitmore and Aldridge, Joy Bennett had stopped trying to guess what time she'd get home. The junior associates joked that the firm owned more of their lives than they did. Most mornings began before sunrise and ended long after the restaurants around downtown Chicago had closed their doors. Empty coffee cups piled up in conference rooms. Half-eaten sandwiches disappeared from office refrigerators. People slept on couches and called it dedication. Competition hung over everything. Every assignment felt like an audition for a future nobody could guarantee. Joy kept her head down and worked. She arrived early, left late, and filled yellow legal pads with notes in neat handwriting that somehow remained organized even at 2 in the morning. While other associates fought to be noticed, Joy focused on making herself useful. "You're going to burn yourself out," Daniel Prescott told her one evening as they stood beside the office vending machines. Daniel had joined the firm the same year she had. He was quick-witted, endlessly talkative, and one of the few people who could make Joy laugh during a 14-hour workday. "I'm already burned out," Joy replied, feeding dollar bills into the machine. "That's actually worse." She smiled. "Thanks for the encouragement." Across the room, Monica Holloway, a senior associate with a reputation for spotting mistakes before anyone else, walked by carrying 3 case files. "If you two have enough energy to joke, I clearly haven't given you enough work." Daniel groaned. "You're enjoying this way too much." Monica didn't even slow down. "You'll thank me in 10 years. Nobody believed her. The firm's senior partners were even more intimidating. Harold Whitmore, one of the founding partners, rarely raised his voice, which somehow made people more nervous around him. Associates straightened their backs whenever he entered a room. And then there was Rebecca Langston. Rebecca had built a reputation as one of the sharpest litigators in Chicago, and Frederick Hayes had somehow landed under her mentorship. She pushed him harder than anyone else. "You've got talent," she told him after a client meeting one afternoon. "The question is whether talent is enough when everyone around you is just as smart." Frederick laughed, trying to hide how seriously he took every word she said. "I'll let you know when I figure that out." Rebecca didn't smile. "Figure it out quickly." That night, close to midnight, Joy wandered into the firm's library looking for a constitutional law reference she'd forgotten to check out earlier. The room was almost empty, lit only by a few lamps tucked between rows of bookshelves. For a moment, she thought she was alone. Then she saw him. Frederick Hayes was asleep at one of the long wooden tables, his head resting awkwardly on a stack of constitutional law books. Pages covered in notes were scattered around him. A pen had slipped from his hand onto the floor. Joy stood there for a second, trying not to laugh. The confident associate who charmed clients and joked his way through meetings looked surprisingly human with his tie loosened and exhaustion written across his face. She glanced at the books spread across the table and realized they were researching the same issue for different cases. Quietly she walked over, pulled several pages from her notebook and placed her own research notes beside his papers. She hesitated for a moment, then turned off the lamp nearest the table and left without saying a word. The next morning, Joy was halfway through a terrible cup of coffee in the cafeteria when someone dropped into the chair across from her. "You saved me 6 hours of work." She looked up to find Frederick holding her handwritten notes. "I have no idea what you're talking about." she said. He raised an eyebrow. Interesting strategy. Joy took another sip of coffee. Did it work? Not really. For the first time, she laughed. Frederick placed the papers on the table. You know, most people would have woken me up. Most people aren't trying to avoid conversations before 8 in the morning. He smiled. Fair enough. So, how do I repay you? You still owe me coffee. He looked at the cup in her hand. That expensive kind from the cafe downstairs or the terrible office coffee? Joy shrugged. Let's stick with the terrible kind. We shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Frederick laughed, and something unexpectedly easy settled between them. Neither of them knew it yet, but that midnight encounter in the library was the beginning of a friendship that would slowly change both of their lives. What surprised Joy most wasn't that she and Frederick fell in love. It was how ordinary it felt. There was no grand moment when everything suddenly changed. No dramatic confession in the rain. Instead, their relationship grew in the quiet spaces between deadlines and ordinary days. It grew during late-night walks back to their apartments after impossible work weeks. It grew over takeout containers balanced on conference tables and conversations that somehow lasted until midnight. One Friday evening, nearly a year after they had met, Joy and Frederick sat on a bench overlooking Lake Michigan, both too exhausted to speak for several minutes. Frederick broke the silence first. Do you ever think about quitting? Joy laughed softly. Every Tuesday. I'm serious. So am I. He turned toward her. Then why don't you? Joy watched the waves roll against the shoreline. Because my parents spent their whole lives working jobs that exhausted them so that I'd have choices they never had. Walking away now would feel like throwing all of that away. Frederick nodded. My answer's less noble. What is it? He smiled, but there was something sad underneath it. I'm terrified of being average. Joy looked at him for a moment. You know, most people spend their lives trying to convince everyone else that they're extraordinary. And I think you're spending your life trying to convince yourself. For once, Frederick didn't have a clever response. 2 years later, they stood in front of a judge and promised to spend the rest of their lives together. Their first apartment wasn't impressive. The kitchen cabinets didn't close properly. The heater made strange noises every winter. Half the furniture came from thrift stores and garage sales. But they were happy. They ate Chinese takeout on the floor because they couldn't afford a dining table yet. They argued about whose turn it was to do laundry. Frederick left wet towels everywhere, and Joy complained about it almost every week. One day, Frederick told her, as they assembled a cheap bookshelf together, we're going to laugh about this apartment. Joy tightened a screw and smiled. Only if we survive putting this thing together. They built a life the way most people do, through hundreds of small moments that didn't seem important at the time. Then, a year after their wedding, Frederick found an advertisement for a neglected lakeside property in Wisconsin. 3 hours north of Chicago, the land sat empty, except for an old dock and patches of wild grass that stretched toward the water. Most people saw inconvenience. Joy and Frederick saw possibility. This place needs a miracle, Joy said as they walked along the shoreline for the first time. Frederick squeezed her hand. Good thing you married an optimist. You are absolutely not the optimist in this marriage. Oh, really? You're the dreamer. There's a difference. A few weeks later, they returned carrying a young maple tree in the back of Frederick's truck. The autumn air was cold enough to sting their faces as they dug into the earth together. Nearby, a small wooden box rested on the grass. Inside were pieces of the future they imagined they would have. Sketches of the house they hoped to build. Photographs from their honeymoon. Letters addressed to children who didn't exist yet. And a handwritten list of names. At the top of Joy's page was the name Amara. Frederick had written Samuel beneath it. Joy held up the paper. You really think we're going to have a son who likes the name Samuel? Frederick shrugged. He won't have much choice. She laughed. You realize that's not how parenting works, right? Then we'll let Amara decide. Joy carefully folded the paper and placed it inside the box. For a few moments, they stood there in silence, staring out at the lake. What do you think we'll be like when we're old? Frederick asked. Joy pretended to consider the question seriously. You'll complain about your back every morning? I absolutely will not. You definitely will. And what about you? She smiled. I'll still be right. Frederick laughed and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Together, they lowered the wooden box into the ground and covered it with soil. Then they planted the maple tree above it. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the lake when Joy rested her head against Frederick's shoulder. We'll come back here when we're old, she whispered. Frederick kissed the top of her head. We'll sit under this tree and pretend we were never young. Joy smiled without looking at him. For the record, I'm never getting old. Then I'll grow old enough for both of us. Standing beside the tiny maple tree, with the lake stretching endlessly behind them, they believed they had all the time in the world. Neither of them understood how fragile dreams could be. By their 5th year at Whitmore and Aldridge, Joy Bennett and Frederick Hayes had settled into the kind of routine that only ambitious people mistake for balance. Most weekdays began before sunrise. Joy would review case files at the kitchen counter, while Frederick ironed his shirt and listened to the morning news. They shared quick breakfasts, exchanged reminders about meetings, and hurried out the door together, convinced that the exhausting pace of their lives was temporary. Once we make partner, things will calm down, Frederick said one morning, adjusting his tie. Joy laughed from behind a stack of legal documents. That's exactly what the partners told us 3 years ago. You're saying they lied? I'm saying lawyers have a complicated relationship with reality. Frederick grinned. Marrying another attorney was a terrible decision. The worst decision of your life. Top 3, at least. The joke followed them into the elevator, but by the time they reached the 32nd floor, both had already shifted into work mode. That same afternoon, Harold Whitmore gathered the firm's senior attorneys and associates inside the largest conference room. The atmosphere felt different immediately. People sat straighter. Conversations disappeared. Even Monica Holloway, who usually looked unimpressed by everything, closed her notebook and waited. Harold placed a thick folder on the table. The state Supreme Court has agreed to hear Anderson v. Illinois Housing Authority. A quiet murmur spread across the room. Everyone understood the significance of the case. The constitutional challenge involved housing rights, government authority, and legal questions that could reshape state law for decades. We've been asked to lead the argument, Harold continued. If we succeed, people will be studying this case in law schools long after we're gone. As assignments were distributed, Joy felt her stomach tighten. She had spent years preparing for an opportunity like this. What she didn't know was that the case would change far more than her career. Over the following weeks, Joy became consumed. Their apartment transformed into an extension of her office. Legal textbooks covered the dining table. Yellow notepads filled the living room. Entire walls disappeared behind handwritten timelines, constitutional precedents, and theories connected by red marker. One Saturday evening, Frederick walked into the kitchen and stopped. Joy stood barefoot in front of the refrigerator, staring at 3 pages of notes she had taped to the door. You've officially lost your mind, he said. Without turning around, she answered, I'm close to something. I can feel it. Frederick walked over and studied the pages. For the next hour, they debated legal arguments, challenged assumptions, and tested different interpretations. Frederick was brilliant at finding weaknesses in opposing positions, but even he could see that the heart of the strategy belonged to Joy. She saw patterns other people missed. Connections appeared to her almost instinctively. 3 nights later, after a preparation meeting, Monica Holloway caught up with Joy outside the conference room. That argument you made about due process? Monica asked. Joy nodded nervously. It's the strongest theory we've got. Joy blinked. You really think so? I've been doing this for 12 years. Trust me, I know talent when I see it. Before Joy could respond, Monica was already walking away. Inside the room, Frederick had overheard the conversation. He smiled when Joy returned to collect her files. What? Nothing, he said. You should be proud of yourself. She smiled back, but Frederick looked away first. The praise continued. Clients began asking for Joy's opinion during meetings. Senior associates stopped by her office to ask questions. Even Harold Whitmore, who rarely complimented anyone, lingered after one strategy session. "Excellent work, Joy," he said, tapping her notes. "You've got an extraordinary legal mind." "Thank you." After he left, Frederick remained seated across the table, organizing papers that didn't need organizing. Joy noticed the silence. "Are you okay?" He forced a smile. "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" She shrugged. "You've been quiet all day." "I'm just tired." It wasn't entirely a lie. He was tired. Tired of feeling proud of her and threatened by her at the same time. The emotion embarrassed him. Every time someone praised Joy, another voice inside him whispered a question he hated hearing. What if she's the extraordinary one? What if you're just standing beside her? He hated himself for thinking it. And because he hated it, he buried it deeper. Late one Thursday afternoon, as Joy prepared for another night at the office, her phone rang. The moment she heard her father's voice, she knew something was wrong. "Joy," Nathaniel Bennett said, struggling to keep his composure. "It's your mother." The folder slipped from her hands. "What's happened?" There was a long silence on the other end. Evelyn had a stroke. For a few seconds, Joy couldn't process what her father had just said. The noise of the office faded into the background. People were talking outside the conference room. Phones were ringing somewhere down the hall. But all she could hear was Nathaniel Bennett's uneven breathing on the other end of the line. "Which hospital?" she asked quietly. "Mercy General. The doctors are running tests now." "I'm leaving." "Drive carefully, sweetheart." Joy hung up and stared at the floor, trying to steady herself. Just 3 hours earlier, she'd been arguing about constitutional precedent. Now none of it seemed to matter. Frederick found her kneeling beside her desk, shoving files into her briefcase with shaking hands. "Joy, what happened?" She looked up, her eyes already filling with tears. "My mum had a stroke." Frederick didn't hesitate. He crouched beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Oh my God! I have to get there. My dad's alone." "Of course you do." For the first time since they'd met, Joy looked completely lost. "The presentation is in 3 weeks," she said, almost apologetically. "The revised argument is still missing citations, and Harold wants the final draft by Monday." Frederick grabbed the folder from her desk. "Forget the presentation." "I can't just forget it." "Joy, your mother is in the hospital." She closed her eyes for a moment, fighting the guilt that had followed her entire life, the feeling that stepping away from responsibility meant letting people down. Then she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a thick binder covered in handwritten notes. Everything was inside. Months of research, legal theories, constitutional precedents, arguments she had rewritten dozens of times in the middle of the night. She held it out to Frederick. "You know this case as well as I do." He accepted the binder carefully. "I'll make sure they understand what you've built." Joy nodded, relieved by the certainty in his voice. "I know you will." An hour later, Frederick stood on the sidewalk outside Union Station, watching her board the evening train. Before the doors closed, she pressed her hand against the window. "Call me after every meeting," she said. "I promise." "Don't let Harold simplify the due process argument." Frederick smiled, despite everything. "Even now, you're giving me instructions." "Someone has to." The train pulled away, carrying Joy toward her family and away from the case that had consumed her life. For the next 2 weeks, hospital corridors replaced conference rooms. Evelyn Bennett survived the stroke, but recovery was slow. Joy spent her days speaking with doctors, comforting her father, and sleeping in uncomfortable waiting room chairs. Every evening, Frederick called with updates from Chicago. The team's making progress. Harold loved the revisions. "Everyone keeps asking about your mum." At first, Joy believed everything was under control. Then the morning of the presentation arrived. Inside Whitmore and Aldridge's main conference room, the firm's leadership gathered around a long mahogany table. Harold Whitmore sat at the head of the room, while senior partners flipped through briefing documents that assistants had prepared overnight. Frederick scanned the papers in front of him. Something immediately caught his attention. Joy's name appeared only once, buried in the list of supporting attorneys. Because she was absent, several revisions had accidentally omitted her from the primary briefing documents. He frowned, considering whether to say something, but Harold was already beginning. "All right, Frederick," the senior partner said. "Let's hear what you've got." Frederick stood. At first, he was nervous. But as he moved through Joy's argument, the constitutional framework, the precedents, the strategy she'd spent months constructing, his confidence grew. The room became completely silent. For nearly an hour, he answered questions, defended positions, and explained theories that had originated on the walls of his apartment. When he finished, Harold leaned back in his chair. My God. Another partner removed his glasses and shook his head. "Frederick, this changes everything." Someone else spoke from the far end of the table. "This is the most innovative constitutional strategy we've seen in years." Frederick's heart pounded. For one brief moment, nobody said anything else. He could still fix it. He could tell them that Joy Bennett had built the argument. He could explain that he was standing on work that belonged as much to his wife as it did to him. Every instinct inside him knew what the right thing was. Instead, he sat back down and said nothing. That evening, long after everyone else had gone home, Frederick sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights outside his window. He replayed the meeting over and over, searching for a version of events that made him feel less ashamed. "It's temporary," he told himself. "Joy will get credit eventually. We're married. What's mine is hers. We're a team." He repeated those thoughts until they almost sounded true. But somewhere deep inside, a quieter voice already understood something terrifying. Silence wasn't protecting Joy. Silence was betraying her. 3 days after the presentation, Joy was sitting beside her mother's hospital bed when Frederick called. Evelyn Bennett had finally fallen asleep after a difficult afternoon of physical therapy. Nathaniel sat in the corner reading the same newspaper article for the third time, too distracted to absorb any of the words. Joy stepped quietly into the hallway and answered the phone. "How did it go?" For a moment, Frederick said nothing. "It went well." Joy leaned against the wall and closed her eyes in relief. How well? They loved the argument. A tired smile spread across her face. "I knew they would. You should have seen Harold's reaction." "I wish I had." Frederick looked out the window of his office at the Chicago skyline. "Your mother comes first." "I know." Joy paused. "Did you tell them which parts still need work?" "Yeah." "Did they understand the due process framework?" "They understood." Joy laughed softly. "Good. I spent 3 months worrying they'd miss the point." Frederick swallowed. They didn't miss it. That answer was technically true. It was also the beginning of a lie that would shape the next 25 years of both their lives. Over the following weeks, the constitutional case exploded beyond the walls of Whitmore and Aldridge. Legal journals praised the firm's strategy. Reporters called for interviews. Clients who had never heard Frederick Hayes's name suddenly wanted meetings with him. One Friday morning, Daniel Prescott walked into Joy's hospital waiting room carrying 2 coffees and a newspaper. "You've got to see this." Joy took the paper and immediately recognized the headline. "Chicago Attorney Leads Groundbreaking Constitutional Argument." Beneath it was a photograph of Frederick standing on the courthouse steps. Joy stared at the picture longer than she intended. Daniel sat beside her. "I know you're probably upset." She folded the newspaper carefully. "Upset isn't the right word." "Then what is?" Joy thought about it for a moment. Confused. Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" She shook her head. "I don't know." The truth was that she couldn't explain the feeling growing inside her. Frederick had promised to protect what they had built together. And yet, every interview, every article, every congratulatory message seemed to move her further into the background of her own work. When she finally returned to Chicago a few weeks later, the city looked exactly the same. But something in her life had shifted. That evening, Whitmore and Aldridge hosted a celebration in the firm's largest conference room. Senior partners moved through the crowd carrying glasses of champagne, while associates congratulated Frederick. Harold Whitmore spotted Joy near the entrance. "Your husband pulled off something remarkable." Joy forced a smile. "He worked very hard." Harold nodded approvingly. "That's an understatement." Across the room, Frederick was surrounded by clients and senior attorneys. When he finally reached her, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "How's your mom?" "Better. Still recovering." "That's good." Joy glanced around the room. "This is bigger than I expected." Frederick laughed awkwardly. "People get excited about strange things." She looked at him carefully. "Did they really think the argument was entirely yours?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated only for a second. "We're a team, Joy." "That's not what I asked." He lowered his voice. "Does it really matter who gets recognized? We're building a future together." But Joy wanted to believe him. More than that, she wanted to believe that the uncomfortable feeling in her chest was simply exhaustion from the last few weeks. So she nodded. "Yeah, you're right." But even as she said the words, something inside her refused to settle. Unknown to both of them, locked inside the firm's archives, sat a set of internal documents that neither had ever seen. Months before the constitutional case reached the conference room, Whitmore and Aldridge's leadership had already approved Frederick Hayes for promotion. The partners had considered him a rising star long before Joy handed him the binder in her office. The betrayal had accomplished nothing. Frederick had sacrificed the truth for recognition he was already destined to receive. Late that night, the celebration continued around them. Associates raised their glasses. Senior partners toasted Frederick's future. Standing beside her husband, Joy smiled when people looked in her direction. And quietly, without saying a word to anyone, she wondered why success always seemed to stop just short of reaching her. The first few years after the constitutional case passed in ways that looked successful from the outside. Frederick Hayes moved into a larger office with windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Clients requested him by name. Invitations to conferences and legal panels arrived almost every week. People at Whitmore and Aldridge began speaking about him as if his future had already been decided. Joy Bennett's future, meanwhile, became strangely difficult to predict. At first, she convinced herself that her opportunities would come eventually. She worked the same long hours, volunteered for difficult assignments, and stayed late to help younger associates prepare for hearings. But promotions kept slipping past her. One spring afternoon, Monica Holloway closed the door to Joy's office and sat down across from her desk. "I'm sorry," Monica said quietly. Joy already understood. "Who got it?" A partner from the Boston office recommended Daniel Whitaker's name. Joy stared at the stack of papers in front of her. "Daniel's been here 3 years." "I know." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Monica leaned forward. "For what it's worth, everyone knows you're one of the smartest attorneys in this building." Joy forced a smile. Apparently, being smart and moving forward aren't the same thing. After Monica left, Joy remained at her desk long after sunset, rereading documents she had written herself, searching for flaws that might explain why success always seemed to stop just short of reaching her. By the time she arrived home, Frederick was already in the kitchen, opening a bottle of wine. "I got the Henderson account," he said, smiling. "That's great." He paused, immediately noticing the exhaustion in her voice. "What happened?" Joy dropped her bag onto the floor. "Nothing." "Joy, they gave the promotion to Daniel Whitaker." Frederick set the bottle down. "I'm sorry." She laughed bitterly. "Are you? Because I'm starting to think I'm the only person in this city who can't figure out what's wrong with me." "There's nothing wrong with you." "Then why does everyone else keep moving ahead?" Frederick walked closer, lowering his voice. "You're being too hard on yourself." For a brief second, guilt flashed across his face. He knew exactly why doors kept opening for him while closing for her. And still, he said nothing. Years passed that way. The conversations about children became less frequent. At first, they delayed because of work. "We should wait until things settle down," Frederick said one night. Joy nodded. "Just another year." Then, another year passed, and another. Eventually, the discussions became awkward, as though they were talking about someone else's future instead of their own. One Saturday afternoon, while driving north toward Wisconsin, Joy stared out the passenger window. "We haven't been to the lake in almost 8 months. Frederick tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "We've both been busy." "We're always busy." Neither of them mentioned the property again for the rest of the drive. When they finally arrived, the maple tree stood taller than either of them remembered. Grass had grown around the old dock, and weeds surrounded the spot where they had once buried their dreams. "We should start building something here," Joy said quietly. Frederick looked toward the lake, but didn't answer immediately. "Maybe next year." Joy smiled sadly. "We've been saying that for 5 years." The truth was that the house wasn't the only thing they had stopped building. Their arguments changed over time. There was no screaming, no slammed doors, just exhaustion. One evening, Joy found Frederick answering emails at 11:30 at night. "Do you ever stop working?" she asked. He didn't look up from his laptop. "Do you?" She stood in the doorway for a moment. "I miss us." Frederick finally raised his eyes. "We're right here." Joy wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that somehow they had become two people sharing an apartment instead of a life. But she was too tired to start another conversation neither of them knew how to finish. Later that night, unable to sleep, Joy opened an old drawer in their bedroom, looking for a phone charger. Instead, she found a folded piece of paper. The edges had yellowed with time. Slowly, she unfolded it. Amara, Samuel, the names they had written on that autumn afternoon beside the lake. Joy sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the handwriting. Then, without waking Frederick, she folded the paper and quietly placed it back in the drawer. The conversation that finally ended their marriage happened on a Tuesday night in early October. There was nothing unusual about the evening. Rain tapped against the apartment windows. The television played quietly in the background, neither of them really watching it. Frederick sat at the dining table reviewing contracts while Joy stood at the sink, rinsing dishes that had been clean for several minutes. For almost an hour, neither of them had spoken. Then Joy turned off the faucet. "I don't think we're happy anymore." Frederick looked up from his papers, as if he'd been expecting those words for years. He set his glasses on the table and rubbed his eyes. "I know." That was what made it so painful. There was no argument to win, no betrayal she could point to, no single moment she could blame. There was only the quiet realization that the life they had imagined together had somehow disappeared while they were busy building careers. Joy sat across from him. "Do you ever think about how different we used to be?" Frederick stared at the rain outside. "All the time. We used to talk about everything." "I know." She laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "And now we can barely get through dinner." For a long time, neither of them said anything. Finally, Frederick spoke. "Maybe we've just changed." Joy wanted to ask whether people really changed that much, or whether they simply stopped pretending to be who they once were. But she was too tired for another conversation that would lead nowhere. 2 months later, the divorce papers were signed. There was no screaming in a courtroom, no dramatic confrontation in a parking lot. Just two exhausted people sitting in separate offices, signing documents that officially ended the most important relationship of their lives. On the morning Joy moved out of the apartment, Frederick carried her last box down to the car. It contained law books, framed photographs, and an old sweater she'd forgotten she still owned. He placed it carefully in the trunk. Joy walked around the car, avoiding his eyes. "I guess this is it." Frederick nodded. "I guess so." She waited, perhaps hoping he would say something that could still save them. Some confession, some explanation, some truth powerful enough to make the last decade make sense. But Frederick said nothing, because the words that mattered most had remained trapped inside him for years. Joy climbed into the driver's seat. "I hope you're happy, Frederick." The sentence wasn't cruel. It wasn't angry. It was simply honest. Frederick opened his mouth, but no answer came. He watched her drive away until the car disappeared at the end of the street. Then he stood alone in the parking lot, carrying a secret that had already cost him more than he understood. For months after the divorce, Joy blamed herself. She blamed herself for not being a better wife, for not being patient enough, for caring too much about work, for failing to become the person she thought Frederick deserved. When Whitmore and Aldridge offered her another corporate assignment 6 months later, she surprised everyone by turning it down. Instead, she accepted a modest position in public service, helping ordinary people navigate the legal system. Daniel Prescott called her the day after the announcement. "You're leaving one of the most prestigious firms in Chicago to work for the county." Joy smiled into the phone. "Apparently. Are you sure?" She looked out the window of her small new office, where a young mother sat nervously on a courthouse bench, holding her son's hand. "For the first time in years, I think I am." The work was different from anything she had done before. She met frightened teenagers facing judges for the first time. She listened to single parents struggling through custody battles. She helped people who couldn't afford expensive attorneys but still deserved someone to hear their stories. Slowly, without realizing it, Joy began to rediscover parts of herself that had been buried beneath ambition and disappointment. Frederick's life moved in the opposite direction. His reputation expanded beyond Chicago. Newspapers quoted him. Universities invited him to speak. 5 years after the divorce, he married Catherine Mercer, a thoughtful architect who admired his intelligence and calm confidence. Together, they had 2 children, Benjamin Hayes and Olivia Hayes. From the outside, Frederick had everything he once wanted. But something inside him remained unreachable. His children loved him, but there was always a distance between them, as though they sensed that part of their father lived somewhere else entirely. His marriage to Catherine slowly fractured under the weight of long silences and emotions he could never explain. Years later, after Catherine left, Frederick found himself driving north alone one autumn evening. The maple tree beside the lake had grown taller than the roofline of the unfinished cabin nearby. As the sun disappeared behind the water, Frederick sat beneath its branches in complete silence. Surrounded by everything he had achieved, he had never felt more alone. The first time someone called Joy Bennett, "Your Honor," she turned around to see who they were talking to. The bailiff smiled. "I'm talking to you, Judge Bennett." Joy let out a quiet laugh and shook her head as she walked toward the bench. Even after years in public service, part of her still felt like the 23-year-old woman carrying 2 suitcases into downtown Chicago, terrified that someone would eventually discover she didn't belong. The courtroom was smaller than the conference rooms she'd once sat in at Whitmore and Aldridge. The walls were plain. The carpet was worn. Most of the people who appeared before her weren't wealthy executives fighting over contracts. They were exhausted parents, frightened teenagers, and ordinary people carrying problems that had followed them for years. And for the first time in her professional life, Joy felt useful. One rainy afternoon, a 17-year-old boy stood before her after being arrested for stealing electronics from a department store. He stared at the floor while his mother quietly cried in the back row. The prosecutor finished speaking and sat down. Joy looked at the boy. "Look at me, please." Slowly, he raised his head. "Do you think you're a bad person?" He frowned, confused by the question. "No, Mom." "Then, why are you here?" The boy hesitated. "My mom lost her job. We were behind on rent. I thought I could sell the stuff and help." The courtroom fell silent. Joy glanced toward the boy's mother, then back at him. "You made a terrible decision, but one bad decision doesn't get to decide who you become for the rest of your life." Years earlier, she had desperately needed someone to tell her the same thing. Word spread through Chicago's legal community that Judge Joy Bennett listened before she judged. Attorneys respected her fairness. Court employees admired her patience. Young lawyers sought her advice. One evening, after speaking at a law school panel, Joy packed her notes into her bag when a nervous student approached her. "Judge Bennett?" Joy smiled. "Yes?" "My name's Ariana Whitfield." She couldn't have been older than 24. I just wanted to thank you for your speech. Sometimes it feels like people walk into these buildings already expecting me to prove I belong." Joy recognized the look in Ariana's eyes immediately. She had worn the same expression herself years earlier. "Come have coffee with me sometime," Joy said. "You'll learn that most people in this profession are making it up as they go." Ariana laughed. A few months later, another young attorney, Leah Kensington, joined Joy's mentorship group. The three women met every other Saturday morning at a small cafe near the courthouse. Leah would bring questions about legal strategy. Ariana worried about balancing ambition with her personal life. Joy listened more than she spoke. "How do you know when you're successful?" Ariana asked one morning. Joy stared into her coffee for a moment. "At my age, I think success is going home at night and liking the person you became during the day." The answer surprised even her, because beneath the calm wisdom she offered others, there were still parts of her life she quietly mourned. Sometimes, walking home from the courthouse, she would pass families pushing strollers through the park and wonder what kind of mother she might have been. On difficult nights, she thought about the children she and Frederick had planned for but never had. Amara, Samuel, the names still lived somewhere inside her, untouched by time. Meanwhile, Frederick continued visiting Wisconsin every autumn. Nobody knew he was still paying taxes on the property. Nobody knew he spent hours sitting beneath the maple tree, staring out at the lake, replaying old conversations in his head. Benjamin and Olivia were adults now, building lives of their own. Catherine Mercer had long since remarried. Frederick's career had reached heights he once thought impossible, yet every achievement felt strangely disconnected from the person he had imagined becoming. One October evening, Joy sat alone in her apartment grading applications for a scholarship program she'd helped establish for young women entering law school. Her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number from Springfield. "Hello? Judge Bennett?" "Yes. My name is Eleanor Watkins, from the governor's office." Joy sat up straighter. "I'm calling because your name is being seriously considered for nomination as Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court." For several seconds, Joy couldn't speak. Outside her window, Chicago traffic moved through the darkness as it always had. But inside her apartment, after decades of disappointment, sacrifice, and quiet reinvention, something extraordinary had just begun. The call from Springfield changed Joy Bennett's daily routine in ways she hadn't expected. Within days, reporters began appearing outside the courthouse. Former colleagues sent congratulatory emails. Law schools invited her to speak about judicial philosophy, fairness, and the future of the legal system. For the first time in years, people weren't talking about the cases she had decided. They were talking about the possibility that she might soon become Chief Justice. Joy accepted the attention politely, but privately, she found it uncomfortable. One evening, after a long day in court, Ariana Whitfield walked beside her toward the parking garage. "Have you thought about what it'll be like?" Ariana asked. What will be like?" "Being Chief Justice." Joy laughed softly. "I haven't even been nominated yet. Everyone knows it's happening. Everyone knows a lot of things that aren't true." Ariana smiled. "You really don't enjoy being the center of attention, do you?" Joy locked her car and shrugged. When you've spent most of your life trying not to disappoint people, attention feels more like pressure than excitement. Across the city, another person was also revisiting Joy's past. Thomas Calloway had spent 20 years as an investigative journalist, covering politics and the courts. He was known for two things: his patience and his refusal to let old stories stay buried. The upcoming Chief Justice nomination had sent him digging through some of the most influential legal cases in Illinois history, searching for the moments that had shaped the state's judicial system. One rainy afternoon, buried inside a university archive, he opened a cardboard box labeled Anderson, 5th Illinois Housing Authority. Firm records at first, nothing seemed unusual. Court transcripts, legal memoranda, research files. Then Thomas noticed something strange. Several handwritten notes attached to the early drafts carried initials that didn't match the public record. He adjusted his glasses and pulled the documents closer. J.B. He kept reading. Page after page contained revisions, constitutional arguments, and handwritten theories signed with the same initials. And the deeper he looked, the stranger the story became. The argument that newspapers had credited to Frederick Hayes decades earlier seemed to have originated somewhere else entirely. Thomas spent the next 2 weeks interviewing former associates and employees from Whitmore and Aldridge. Most remembered the case. Few remembered who had actually built it. But Monica Holloway remembered. "I always thought something about that story didn't add up," she admitted over coffee. Thomas leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Monica stared out the window for a moment. Frederick was talented, nobody questioned that. But the constitutional framework, the heart of the argument, that sounded like Joy. "Did you ever say anything?" She shook her head. "At the time, nobody had any reason to doubt the version we'd been given." Thomas left the meeting with more questions than answers. 3 days later, he tracked down Daniel Prescott. Daniel sat quietly after Thomas explained what he'd found. "Joy practically lived inside that case," Daniel said at last. "You think the strategy was hers?" Daniel sighed. "I think she stopped believing in herself because she spent years watching other people celebrate work she'd poured herself into." The article wasn't published immediately. Thomas knew the accusation was too serious. He needed proof. That proof arrived in the form of 3 forgotten storage boxes discovered in the basement archives of Whitmore and Aldridge. Inside were dozens of original drafts, yellow legal pads, handwritten notes, entire sections of legal analysis written in Joy Bennett's unmistakable handwriting. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. The legal community reacted with disbelief. Former colleagues called one another late into the night. Law professors debated the findings. Journalists began rewriting the history of one of Illinois' most important constitutional victories. And sitting alone in her apartment, Joy stared at copies of her own handwriting from 25 years earlier. Page after page, theory after theory, evidence of a brilliance she had spent decades convincing herself she never possessed. The room felt impossibly quiet. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider something she had never truly believed. Maybe she hadn't failed after all. Maybe the life she lost had been taken from her. But even as that thought settled into her mind, Thomas Calloway called with news of another discovery. Something buried in the firm's internal records. Something far more devastating than the theft itself. Joy barely slept the night after Thomas Calloway called. The copies of the old legal drafts were still spread across her dining room table the next morning, exactly where she had left them. Yellow pages filled with her own handwriting sat beside coffee cups that had long gone cold. For hours, she had read the same sentences over and over. Arguments she had created, theories she had built from scratch, notes written in the margins at 2 o'clock in the morning by a younger version of herself who had believed that hard work and talent would eventually be enough. At 9:30, Thomas arrived at her apartment carrying a thin manila folder. "I didn't want to discuss this over the phone," he said quietly as Joy let him inside. She glanced at the folder. "What's in there?" Thomas hesitated. "Internal records from Whitmore and Aldridge." Joy sat across from him at the kitchen table. Outside, the streets of Chicago moved as they always had, but inside the apartment, everything felt strangely still. Thomas opened the folder and slid a document toward her. At the top of the page, stamped with a date from 25 years earlier, were the words, "Partnership Review Committee, Confidential." Joy frowned. "I don't understand." "Keep reading." Her eyes moved slowly across the page. The document detailed Frederick Hayes' upcoming promotion, salary increase, and expanded responsibilities at the firm. The approval date was impossible to ignore. It had been signed nearly 3 months before the constitutional presentation. 3 months before Joy handed him her research. 3 months before he stood in that conference room and accepted praise that belonged to both of them. Joy looked up, confused. "No." Thomas said nothing. She picked up the paper again, convinced she had misunderstood something. "This has to be wrong. I verified it with 3 former administrators." Joy pushed back from the table. "No, you don't understand." Her voice cracked. He told himself he needed that case. He told himself he needed recognition. That's why. The words caught in her throat. Because suddenly, the explanation she had unconsciously given Frederick for 25 years no longer existed. He had never needed her work. The promotion had already been his. For a long time, Joy simply stared at the papers. Then, quietly, she asked the question that had haunted her for decades. So what was it all for? Thomas didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that could make sense of 25 lost years. After he left, Joy walked through her apartment in silence. She opened closets she rarely used. She stood in front of windows without seeing the city beyond them. She sat on the edge of her bed and tried to understand how a single decision had reshaped the entire course of her life. For 25 years, she had believed she wasn't talented enough. She had believed promotions disappeared because she lacked something essential. She had believed the marriage collapsed because she wasn't enough, as a lawyer, as a wife, as a partner. Now, at 58 years old, she was being forced to mourn a different truth. She mourned the marriage she thought they had built. She mourned the children they had postponed, until time quietly took the choice away. Most of all, she mourned the younger version of herself who had spent decades carrying blame that was never hers to carry. That evening, Ariana Whitfield and Leah Kensington came to her apartment with takeout containers and far too many questions. Leah paced across the living room. "He stole your work, Joy. The entire country deserves to know what he did." Ariana nodded. "You could destroy his reputation with one interview." Joy sat on the couch, still holding the old partnership documents. "And then what?" Leah stopped walking. "What do you mean? And then what?" Joy looked down at her hands. "Does humiliating him give me back the children we never had?" Neither woman answered. "Does it give me back my 30s, my marriage, the years I spent wondering whether I was smart enough?" Ariana sat beside her. "No." Joy leaned back and closed her eyes. "I've already lost too much. I'm not going to spend whatever time I have left building my life around bitterness." Across the city, Frederick Hayes sat alone in his study. The diagnosis from his doctor sat unopened beside him. In front of him was another document, the deed to the Wisconsin property. Slowly, he placed it into an envelope. Then he began writing the letter he should have written 25 years earlier. The envelope arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Joy almost threw it onto the pile of unopened mail beside her front door. For weeks, reporters had been calling, former colleagues had been leaving messages, and strangers had begun sending letters about her possible appointment as Chief Justice. She assumed this was just another piece of correspondence she would deal with later. Then she saw the handwriting. For a moment, she simply stood there in the hallway, her keys still in her hand. 25 years had passed since she and Frederick Hayes had signed divorce papers in separate offices, but she recognized his handwriting immediately. It was the same slanted script that had once filled birthday cards, grocery lists, and the labels on the sketches they had buried beside the lake in Wisconsin. Slowly, she turned the envelope over. There was no return address. Just her name, Joy Bennett. Nothing else. She carried it into the kitchen and placed it on the table, telling herself she would open it after dinner. But dinner came and went. The envelope remained untouched. The next morning, it was still there. And the morning after that. Days passed. Each time she walked into the kitchen, her eyes drifted toward it. But something stopped her from breaking the seal. Part of her was afraid of finding another lie. Another part was afraid of finding the truth. Meanwhile, Frederick sat alone in a private hospital room on the north side of Chicago, watching snow collect on the window ledge outside. The illness had moved faster than anyone expected. Benjamin Hayes had flown in from Seattle 2 days earlier. Olivia Hayes sat beside her father's bed, reading messages from relatives and family friends. "You should get some rest, Dad," Olivia said softly. Frederick smiled weakly. "I've had plenty of rest." Benjamin pulled a chair closer. "The doctors are optimistic." Frederick looked at his son for a long moment. "You don't have to pretend for me." Benjamin lowered his eyes. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then Frederick asked the question that surprised both of his children. "Did the package get delivered?" Olivia nodded. "The one to Judge Bennett?" "Yes. It arrived yesterday." Frederick turned back toward the window. He didn't ask whether Joy had opened it. Deep down, he already knew she probably hadn't. Because after everything he had taken from her, what words could possibly still matter? Across the city, Joy tried to focus on the preparations for her confirmation ceremony. Her dining room table was covered with briefing folders, schedules, and notes from the governor's office. Assistants called constantly. Reporters requested interviews she had no interest in giving. Yet every evening, when the apartment finally became quiet, her attention returned to the envelope. On the 12th day, Ariana Whitfield stopped by with coffee and found Joy staring at it. "You still haven't opened it?" Joy shook her head. "I don't know if I can." Ariana sat down across from her. "What are you afraid of?" Joy thought for a moment. "I'm afraid that whatever's inside won't change anything." Before Ariana could respond, Joy's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" There was a brief silence. "Judge Bennett, I'm sorry to tell you this, but Frederick Hayes passed away early this morning." Joy didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the envelope sitting in the center of the kitchen table. Outside her apartment window, Chicago was waking up. Buses moved through the streets. Store owners unlocked their doors. Somewhere downtown, people hurried to jobs that suddenly seemed very far away. In less than 3 weeks, Joy would stand before the entire state and take the oath as Chief Justice. But in that moment, none of it mattered. All she could think about was the question she had spent 25 years avoiding. What had Frederick been too ashamed to tell her while he was still alive? After the call ended, Joy sat alone in silence. Then, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she stood up, walked to the bedroom closet, and pulled down an old cardboard box. Inside was a faded photograph of the lakeside property in Wisconsin. The maple tree in the picture was barely taller than they were. Joy stared at it for a long time. By sunset, she had made her decision. For the first time in more than 2 decades, she was going back to the lake. Joy left Chicago before sunrise. The city was still dark when she pulled onto the highway, a travel mug of coffee sitting untouched in the cup holder beside her. Frederick's envelope rested on the passenger seat, exactly where she had placed it the night before. Even now, after his death, she couldn't bring herself to open it. For most of the drive north, she kept the radio off. 25 years had passed since she had last made this trip alone, yet her body seemed to remember the route without her help. Certain exits felt familiar. Certain gas stations brought back memories she hadn't visited in decades. Around noon, the city disappeared behind her, replaced by long stretches of highway and small Wisconsin towns preparing for winter. And then, finally, she saw the old wooden sign, Lake Willow Road. Joy slowed the car and turned onto the narrow gravel path. At first, she barely recognized the place. The shoreline looked smaller than she remembered, though she knew that wasn't true. Time had simply changed her sense of distance. The old dock leaned slightly to one side, weathered by decades of snow and rain. And standing near the water, taller than the roof of any nearby building, was the maple tree. Joy turned off the engine but didn't get out immediately. The last time she had stood beneath that tree, she and Frederick had been young enough to believe that dreams could wait indefinitely. Now the branches stretched high into the grey afternoon sky, carrying the weight of 25 lost years. She stepped out of the car and walked slowly toward the lake. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold water. As she approached the shoreline, something beyond the maple tree caught her attention. For a moment, she simply stared. There was a house. Not the grand lakeside home they had once sketched on napkins and legal pads. This one was smaller, quieter, almost hidden among the trees. The porch remained unfinished, and the paint had begun to fade in places. It looked less like a dream fulfilled, and more like someone had spent years trying to apologize with lumber and nails. Joy stood there, struggling to understand. "He built it," she whispered to herself. Slowly, she walked toward the front door. The key had been taped to the back of Frederick's envelope. Inside, the house was simple. A small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a stone fireplace. Bookshelves lined one wall, half filled with legal textbooks and novels she recognized from their old apartment in Chicago. Nothing inside felt luxurious. Everything felt personal. Joy ran her fingers across the kitchen counter, noticing tiny imperfections in the woodwork. Frederick had never been good with his hands. The realization made her smile despite herself. For the next hour, she wandered from room to room in silence. And then, in the corner of the living room, she noticed something strange. One of the floorboards sat slightly higher than the others. Kneeling down, Joy pressed against the wood. It shifted. Her heart began to pound. Carefully, she lifted the loose board and reached into the space beneath it. A few seconds later, her fingers touched rough wood. The box. For 25 years, she had imagined what might have happened to the little wooden box they buried beneath the maple tree. Now it sat in her hands, protected from time, and hidden beneath the floor. She carried it to the kitchen table and slowly opened the lid. Inside, everything remained exactly as they had left it. The honeymoon photographs, the sketches of the house they once dreamed of building, the faded list of names, Amara, Samuel, and beneath the photographs sat 2 sealed letters addressed to children who had never existed. Joy picked one up carefully. The handwriting belonged to her younger self. For several minutes, she simply stared at the envelope. The room around her felt impossibly quiet, as though time itself had stopped somewhere between the past and the present. Then, tucked beneath the letters, she noticed something she had never seen before. A black leather journal. Frederick's journal. Joy slowly reached for it. For a long time, Joy Bennett simply stared at the journal resting on the kitchen table. Outside, the wind moved through the branches of the maple tree, brushing softly against the unfinished walls of the house. The lake beyond the window had turned dark grey under the evening sky, and the room was growing colder by the minute. She almost put the journal back into the box. 25 years earlier, Frederick Hayes had kept secrets that had changed the course of both their lives. Part of her wasn't sure she could survive discovering another one, but eventually she opened the cover. Most of the pages were blank. Only a handful contained writing. The first entry had been written 12 years earlier. October 18th. The tree is taller than the house now. I spent the afternoon fixing the porch steps and thinking about how strange it is to build something for someone who may never see it. Joy swallowed hard and turned the page. Benjamin called today. Olivia starts her new job next month. They are good children, but I don't think they've ever known me completely. Maybe that's my fault. Maybe you can't spend decades hiding from yourself and still expect other people to recognize who you are. She kept reading. Each entry felt less like a journal and more like a conversation Frederick had been too afraid to have while he was alive. Some pages described his visits to the lake. Others described the silence that followed his second divorce. And almost every page returned to the same person, Joy. Halfway through the journal, an envelope slipped onto the table. Inside were legal documents. At first, Joy assumed they were property records. Then she noticed the names, scholarship agreements, university endowments, trust funds. Page after page revealed donations worth millions of dollars, all directed towards scholarships for young women entering law school. The final document contained a handwritten note. I spent my life taking opportunities from someone who deserved them. This won't fix what I broke, but maybe it will help someone else walk into a courtroom without doubting whether she belongs there. Joy set the papers down and covered her mouth with her hand. For years she had imagined Frederick living comfortably with his success, untouched by regret. The truth was far more complicated. Success had given him recognition. It had given him money. It had given him influence. But it had never given him peace. As darkness settled outside, Joy returned to the journal. Near the end, she found the final entry. There was no date, just a single paragraph written in unsteady handwriting. I spent my whole life afraid that you would outshine me. Every award I received, every promotion, every headline reminded me of what I had done. I thought success would silence my guilt, but success only gave me a better view of everything I lost. In the end, the greatest punishment wasn't losing our marriage. It was realizing that the person I spent years competing against was the only person who ever truly loved me. Joy read the words 3 times. Not because she didn't understand them, because she did. Too well. She thought about the young man asleep in the law firm's library, the one she'd quietly helped without expecting anything in return. She thought about winter walks beside Lake Michigan and take-out dinners in their first apartment. She thought about the children they had named but never held. For years she had believed Frederick destroyed their marriage because he didn't love her enough. Sitting alone in that unfinished house, she finally understood something even sadder. He had loved her. He had simply loved his own fear more. Hours passed. Joy wrapped herself in an old blanket she found in the living room and sat beside the window, watching moonlight dance across the water. For the first time since learning the truth, she wasn't angry. She was grieving. Grieving the years they had lost. Grieving the people they could have become. Grieving the ordinary life that had slipped away because one man couldn't bear the thought of standing in someone else's shadow. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion finally pulled her to sleep. When she opened her eyes again, pale morning light was spreading across the lake. The sun rose slowly behind the maple tree, illuminating the shoreline they had once imagined growing old beside together. And for the first time in decades, Joy felt ready to say goodbye. Joy stood beneath the maple tree just after sunrise, her hands buried deep inside the pockets of her coat. The lake was quiet. A thin layer of mist floated above the water, and somewhere in the distance, birds called to one another across the shoreline. 25 years earlier, she and Frederick had stood in this exact spot, laughing as they covered a wooden box with dirt, convinced that they had all the time in the world. Now she was standing there alone. The tree towered over her, its trunk scarred by decades of storms and harsh winters. Joy reached out and rested her hand against the rough bark. "We really thought we'd come back here when we were old," she whispered. For a moment, she could almost hear Frederick's voice answering her. Not the older version of him who had spent years drowning in regret, but the young man from the office library who had smiled over terrible coffee and promised her a future beside the lake. The memory hurt more than she expected, because grief wasn't only about losing people. Sometimes, grief was about losing the versions of yourself that had once believed in certain futures. Joy walked back into the house and sat at the kitchen table. The 2 unopened letters still lay inside the wooden box. One was written in Frederick's handwriting. The other was written in hers. Slowly, she opened Frederick's letter first. "Dear Amara and Samuel, if you're reading this, your mother and I are probably sitting on the porch, arguing about who forgot to buy groceries. Your mother will pretend she isn't laughing, but she always laughs eventually. I hope you inherit her kindness and her patience. I hope you inherit her sense of justice and her ability to see people clearly. Most of all, I hope you grow up knowing that there is nothing in this world more important than telling the truth to the people you love." Joy stopped reading. For several seconds, she couldn't breathe. The cruelest part wasn't the words themselves. It was knowing that the man who wrote them had eventually failed to live by them. She wiped her eyes and unfolded her own letter. "Dear Amara and Samuel, your father and I don't know who you'll become yet, but we already know one thing. We want you to feel safe enough to tell us when you're afraid, when you've made mistakes, and when life feels unfair. We hope this house becomes a place where honesty matters more than appearances, and where people are loved for who they are, not for what they achieve." Joy stared at the page. The younger version of herself who had written those words had no idea what was waiting for her. She had spent 25 years believing she wasn't talented enough, believing she wasn't extraordinary enough, believing that somewhere along the way she had failed. But standing in that unfinished house, she finally understood something that no promotion, no marriage, and no betrayal could ever change. Her worth had never depended on someone else's ability to recognize it. Quietly, she folded both letters and placed them back inside the box. Then she carried the box outside. Beneath the maple tree, she sat for nearly an hour, speaking softly to the people she had once been. To the young woman who arrived in Chicago carrying 2 suitcases and impossible expectations. To the wife who postponed motherhood because she trusted that there would always be more time. To the lawyer who spent decades doubting herself because of someone else's fear. "You were enough," Joy whispered. The words weren't for Frederick. They were for herself. By noon, she locked the door to the house for the final time and placed the key inside the mailbox. As she drove south toward Springfield, the lake disappeared in her rearview mirror. 3 weeks later, Joy Bennett stood inside the state capitol, one hand raised as she took the oath of office as Chief Justice. Politicians applauded. Judges smiled. Cameras flashed from every corner of the room. But Joy's thoughts drifted briefly to a small lakeside property in Wisconsin and to the young couple who had once buried their dreams beneath a maple tree. The victory mattered, not because history had finally corrected itself, not because the truth had been uncovered, and not because Frederick's name had been tarnished. It mattered because, after betrayal, heartbreak, and years of doubt, she had rebuilt a life rooted in compassion instead of bitterness. That evening, alone in her office, Joy looked out over the lights of Springfield and thought about the lessons she wished she could give to every young person walking into the world, afraid they weren't enough. Another person's insecurity can wound your life. It can steal opportunities, distort your confidence, and leave scars that last for years. But your worth was never theirs to decide. And with that truth finally resting in her heart, Joy turned off the lights, closed the door behind her, and stepped into the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. Before you go, take a moment to think about this. Have you ever spent years doubting yourself because of someone else's choices, words, or insecurities? Joy's story reminds us that sometimes the hardest battle isn't proving our worth to the world. It's remembering that our worth was never determined by anyone else's fears in the first place. If this story touched you, share in the comments. What is one dream or part of yourself that you refuse to let other people's doubts take away? And if you're new to Daily Comfort Stories, don't forget to subscribe and join our family as we continue sharing stories about love, loss, resilience, and the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a life. Until our next story, take care of yourself, and never let someone else's insecurity decide who you are.